The mist hung low like a veil draped over the forest's breadth, and the road ahead looked as if it vanished into a realm untouched by time. Birds had not yet begun their chorus. The world was still waking, but something was wrong. Too quiet, too still. Park Ranger Thomas had driven this winding mountain road 100 times before, yet never had he seen it like this, lined with abandoned cars, their doors open, engines idling, and people standing in hushed confusion. Some held up their phones, but no one dared step closer. It was as if the forest itself had pressed pause. As Thomas edged forward in his patrol vehicle, his headlights pierced the mist just enough to reveal the source of the disruption, and it didn't make sense at first. Lying across the middle of the road, like a wall of fur and muscle, was a family of bears. A massive male, his coat ragged and damp, sat closest to the center line. Beside him, a female curled slightly around 2 cubs, their small forms nestled tightly against her flank. They weren't snarling. They weren't frightened. And most striking of all, they weren't moving. The sight was surreal. Not a display of dominance. Not a random wander through human territory. They had chosen this exact place and settled in as if anchored by something invisible and heavy. Thomas stepped out slowly, scanning the scene, waiting for movement, for any sign of typical bear behavior. But there was none. The family was alert but motionless, eyes scanning something distant beyond the trees, or perhaps something deeper within themselves. The air carried a weight that words couldn't describe. Drivers, who had moments earlier been annoyed or curious, now stood silent. No one raised their voice. No one dared disturb the moment. Whatever this was, it wasn't a disruption. It was a vigil, an act of presence, a protest made not of rage but of silence. And without knowing why, Thomas felt it too, that whatever had brought this bear family here was not random. It was personal. By mid-morning, the sun had burned away the mist, revealing the quiet standoff in full daylight. Yet nothing had changed. The bears were still there, lying across the 2-lane road, like a barrier nature itself had placed. The asphalt grew warmer under the rising sun, but the bears remained in their positions. A few of the cubs shifted, one even stretched a paw, but none of them strayed. The adult pair, especially the mother, stayed rooted. They blinked. They breathed, but they did not move. More rangers arrived, parking at a cautious distance and approaching slowly on foot. They carried noisemakers, food bait, even gentle deterrents designed to usher wildlife back into the safety of the forest. But none of it worked. A sudden clapping sound that would normally spook any wild animal into retreat barely registered with the bears. Pieces of raw fish and fruit were placed just beyond the road's edge, but they went untouched. It was as if the bears couldn't hear, couldn't smell, couldn't see, except for one direction. Every few minutes, the mother would glance toward the same area beyond the embankment, her eyes lingering on something invisible to the human crowd. Thomas observed carefully, his instincts unsettled. He had dealt with territorial bears before, had seen them act out of fear, hunger, or protectiveness. But this wasn't any of those. There was no puffed chest, no posturing, no frantic energy. This was something deeper, more controlled. The kind of stillness that didn't come from contentment, but from pain. Like animals holding a vigil for something lost. As rangers adjusted their positions, someone on the outer edge of the scene pointed toward the slope. The forest dipped there, where tall grasses swallowed the terrain into a low gully hidden from the road. It was steep but accessible, and that's when someone noticed what the bears had likely seen long before any human could. The mother's eyes, again and again, returned to that one spot, not scanning, not searching, just looking, quietly, repeatedly, as if watching over something that no longer moved. The bears weren't waiting for food. They weren't protesting traffic. They were grieving. But no one yet understood the full weight of what had happened beneath the tall grass, just out of view. The low hum of the drone cut softly through the morning air as it lifted above the trees, its camera tilting to capture what human eyes on the ground could not. As it drifted over the slope beside the road, past the line of vehicles and the solemn figures of the bear family, the forest floor came into view, lush, green, and quiet. And then, just beyond the reach of the embankment, nestled in a bed of flattened grass, the drone revealed the truth no one wanted to see. There, lying still in the shade of a sapling, was the lifeless form of a bear cub. Small, fragile, and heartbreakingly still. Its body was partially covered in soil and leaves, not in the careless scatter of wind or weather, but in a way that felt intentional, as if someone had tried to protect it from the elements, as if the tiny creature had been gently tucked in by a hand that couldn't bear to say goodbye. Gasps escaped from the watchers below as the footage streamed to their handheld screens. What had begun as an unexplained disruption now took on the form of something sacred. The pieces fit together with devastating clarity. The cub had likely been struck the night before by a passing vehicle, an accident in the dark, unnoticed until too late. The parents, unable to save it, must have carried its body away from the road, into the soft cradle of the forest floor. And they had not left its side since. The realization swept through the gathered rangers like a chill. The bears weren't simply lingering. They weren't confused or lost. They were grieving, mourning, keeping vigil beside the body of a lost child. The two remaining cubs stayed close, perhaps too young to understand fully, yet feeling the heaviness that blanketed the clearing. This wasn't an act of defiance. It wasn't a wild spectacle. It was a funeral. In their silence, in their unmoving posture, the bears had said more than any growl or roar could ever convey. They had drawn a line in the forest and chosen to stay with their dead until their hearts allowed them to let go. And for the first time, the humans watching understood. They were witnesses to a sorrow far older and more primal than words. Grief in the wild is often hidden, buried beneath instinct and survival, masked by the harshness of nature's rhythm. But here, on this forest road now transformed into something sacred, the raw weight of loss was laid bare for all to see. These weren't dangerous animals disrupting order. They were a family frozen in sorrow, anchored not by threat, but by love. The male bear, massive and usually the more aloof in a natural hierarchy, now lay closest to the cub's small resting place. His body stretched long and still, not in sleep but in something heavier. His head remained lowered, not in submission, but in quiet defense, as if shielding what little remained of the life they had lost. He didn't growl or chase the onlookers. He simply stayed. The mother was quieter still. Her movements were slow, delicate, barely noticeable. She used her paw to brush the grass beside the small mound where the cub lay, not to uncover it, but to tend to it, as if even now she wanted it to rest more comfortably. She didn't wail or fight. She simply moved with the tenderness of someone who knew the finality of loss and had chosen to remain near it anyway. One of the surviving cubs nuzzled her gently, seeking warmth, perhaps reassurance. It didn't understand why its sibling no longer moved or why its parents had changed, but it felt the shift. Even the smallest hearts recognize silence when it becomes heavy. On the road above, the mood had shifted completely. Where there was once irritation, there was reverence. People no longer viewed the bears as a curiosity or a problem to be solved. They watched like mourners at a ceremony, unsure if they belonged, but knowing it mattered that they were present. A woman clutched her daughter's hand tighter. An elderly man lowered his phone, too moved to film anymore. There were no loud voices, no footsteps forward, just stillness, mirroring the grief below. In the hierarchy of the wild, death is often accepted and quickly passed. But this was something more. A visible ache, a refusal to move on, a message written not in language, but in presence. And for once, humans didn't try to interfere. They simply bore witness. The footage made its way online before noon. A quiet clip, less than a minute long, captured from the drone's perspective. No music, no voiceover, just the image of a bear family lying motionless beside a small mound of earth, framed by the forest's muted green. It spread like wildfire, not for its drama, but for its quiet power. Within hours, the video had reached millions. Comments poured in, some in disbelief, others overcome with emotion. Parents wrote about their own losses. Animal lovers wept openly. Even those who rarely gave wildlife a second thought admitted the footage had stopped them cold. As the digital world reeled from the unexpected heartbreak, real life continued to unfold on that quiet stretch of mountain road. News crews began to arrive, their vans pulling in from distant cities, but were kept at bay by a firm and unified message from the Rangers. This was not a story to exploit. It was not a stage. The bears were not actors in a tragedy. They were the heart of it, and hearts deserve peace. Thomas, who had witnessed the stillness from the beginning, made the call few expected. Rather than force the bears to leave, he rerouted traffic miles away. Signs were posted with a simple message: wildlife and mourning. Respect the space. The park administration agreed. No tranquilizers. No relocation plans. This space, for now, would not belong to schedules or convenience. It would belong to the grieving. Throughout the next day, more officials and volunteers arrived, but their tools were not traps. They carried rope and wooden stakes, not for fencing, but for marking boundaries. Not to keep bears in, but to keep people out. Some brought flowers. Not dozens, not in piles, just one or two, left silently by the roadside. A gesture, a recognition, a form of human mourning, placed gently into the language of the wild. What began as a traffic incident had shifted into something sacred. The road no longer served its original purpose. It had become something else entirely, a space suspended between species, where grief was no longer divided by language or biology, a place where, for once, human hearts broke not from fear of the wild, but from understanding it. Dawn arrived softer than before, filtering through the forest with a hush that seemed to acknowledge the sorrow it illuminated. The mist didn't cling as tightly this time, as if the sky itself had begun to release its hold. The bears were still there, lying beside the road's edge near the cubs' resting place. But something in their stillness had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. It was the mother who rose first. Slowly, without urgency or alarm. Her movements carried a different weight now. She didn't glance at the humans who had gathered quietly in the distance. She didn't acknowledge the perimeter markers or the cautious presence of the Rangers. Her entire focus was on what lay just below the embankment, beneath the loose soil and soft grass. She stepped toward it and lowered her head, nudging the mound gently with her snout. It was not an act of grief anymore. It was one of farewell. The male followed close behind. For a moment, they both stood at the site together, unmoving, before beginning a quiet task that left every onlooker breathless. They began to gather dirt and leaves, not in panic or confusion, but with slow, purposeful movements. One paw at a time, they pushed forest debris onto the small mound. They worked together, side by side, their gestures deliberate. It was not instinctual disposal. It was not random. It was, by every unspoken measure, a burial. No one spoke. No one moved. The Rangers stood where they were, unwilling to break the sanctity of the moment. Even the camera crews lowered their lenses. The air felt thick with reverence as the bears finished their work. When the cub's body was finally covered, the mother settled down beside it once more. She didn't cry. She didn't howl. Instead, she placed her head gently against the ground, against the very earth that now cradled what she had lost. A final touch. A closing of a chapter no creature should ever have to write. Then, with the same grace and silence that had defined their vigil, she stood. The father turned toward the forest. The two remaining cubs, still unsure but willing to follow, came close. And together, the family stepped back into the trees. They didn't look back. Not once. Because in their world, the ritual had been completed. The goodbye had been spoken, not in sound but in presence. And it was enough. The images spread faster than anyone expected. A single photograph, captured from a respectful distance, showed the moment the mother bear placed her forehead against the freshly covered earth. There were no dramatic angles, no filters or edits, just raw stillness. And yet, within hours, it circled the globe. News outlets picked up the story, headlines carrying words like mourning, ritual, and grief in the same sentence as wildlife. Experts were quick to respond. Some debated the language, cautious to avoid anthropomorphizing. Grief, after all, was a human word, or so it was thought. But others, more attuned to behavior and experience, didn't hesitate. They acknowledged what the world had seen. Not just instinct, but intention. Something had happened on that road that couldn't be explained away by biology alone. But it wasn't the scientists or journalists who defined the moment. It was the people. Thousands of them. They filled comment sections and news articles with stories of their own losses, of pets who stayed beside their companions after death, of wild animals who lingered near lifeless kin. They didn't need permission to believe what they saw. They had felt it too. Donations began to arrive from every continent, many small, some large, but none given out of pity. They came with handwritten notes, digital messages, and quiet prayers, not for justice, but for acknowledgement, for respect. In response, the park quietly erected a small memorial, nothing polished or promotional, just a piece of weathered wood, carved with the outline of a cub, and 4 simple words that echoed louder than any broadcast ever could. You were seen. Visitors began to come, not in crowds, but gently. They left pine cones and children's sketches, small stuffed bears, and paper hearts. One child's note, barely legible, had been folded carefully and tucked into a stone. It read, "Thank you for reminding us that grief belongs to all hearts, not just human ones." And there, on the edge of a forest where a family once stayed to say goodbye, the world responded not with noise, but with quiet reverence, a collective whisper of understanding. The weeks slipped by as they always did, one indistinguishable sunrise folding into another. Life had returned to the road, and cars once again moved along its bends without hesitation. But for Thomas, the memory of that place had never dulled. So one quiet morning, without an announcement or assignment, he drove back. The forest welcomed him with its usual hush. Birds chirped overhead, and the wind moved gently through the trees. But the clearing near the bend, that clearing, held a different kind of silence. The grass had grown taller now, brushing gently against the wooden marker that still stood where the cub had been buried. No fanfare, no decay, just presence. Thomas stepped out of his truck and approached the marker. His hand reached out almost without thinking, fingertips grazing the worn wood carved with the outline of a bear cub. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. But in the quiet space between his heartbeat and breath, something settled. A stillness. A reverence. He remembered the father bear lying protectively beside the cub, unmoving in his sorrow. He saw again the mother's slow, deliberate farewell, the way she had pressed her forehead to the earth with a grief so honest it didn't need translation. And he understood, more clearly now than ever before, that love, the kind that transcends instinct, is not limited by species. It does not explain itself. It does not hurry. It stays, even when it hurts. When he finally turned back to his truck, he didn't rush. He eased into the seat, started the engine, and drove. Slowly, quietly, because some places deserve to be passed through with respect. Nature rarely demands our attention, and yet when it does, it speaks in ways that leave echoes long after the moment fades. The story of the bears on that mountain road wasn't one of wilderness interrupting civilization. It was a quiet reminder that the heart beats just as fiercely beneath fur as it does beneath skin. That sorrow is not a uniquely human burden. That love, when it runs deep enough, transcends every barrier we think exists between us and the wild. It wasn't about traffic delays or wildlife protocols. It wasn't about the drone footage or the headlines that followed. It was about a mother who couldn't leave her child behind, a father who kept guard without sound, 2 young cubs learning, perhaps too early, that not every journey ends in reunion. And it was about those who watched, who listened, and who chose not to turn away. The bears didn't stay for spectacle. They didn't stay for sympathy. They stayed because something had been lost, and they needed the world to pause while they grieved. In doing so, they taught every onlooker something that couldn't be put into words, that mourning is a language all living beings understand, and that farewell, true farewell, takes time. Maybe that's what we forget too often in our rush to move on. That grief isn't weakness. It's devotion. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do, for ourselves or for others, is to stay a little longer. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to our channel, where we share more true stories of connection, compassion, and the silent wisdom of the wild. Every view, every share, helps us bring these moments to light, moments that remind us we're not so different after all. Until next time, stay kind, Stay curious, and never stop believing in the quiet strength of love.